Hello, listeners. This is Jeannine
and Kristin
from Henrico Casa. You are listening to our podcast, Vigilant Voices. Living life every day. Hello, listeners. Thanks so much for joining us for yet another episode of our Vigilant Voices podcast.
Yes, we are always happy to have you with us and love exploring topics that matter to the children we serve in our daily work at Henrico Casa.
But also the children who are in your life, listeners.
Yes, and as always, our goal is to know more about the challenges facing children and families so that we can ensure no child faces continued abuse or neglect.
That is always our goal. And so the challenge we want to talk about today is building attachment.
Yes.
And defined on a basic level, attachment is the emotional bond that forms between a child and their primary caregiver, which is usually, and hopefully understandably, a parent.
Right. And usually this isn't a challenge for children who grow up with consistent, attentive, nurturing parents or caregivers. Attachment, just forms naturally for these children.
Exactly. But it can certainly be more of a challenge for our little ones who aren't born into or raised in that type of stable environment.
Right.
And in more severe scenarios, attachment disruptions can lead to avoidance, aggression, or other symptoms of what we actually call attachment disorders.
Right. And that was actually a major concern that we had for little Mateo, who I was going to share about in today's CASA case story. Okay. Again, changing names because we want to protect privacy for these little ones. But Mateo has two loving parents, but they both have a history of substance abuse. And that substance abuse turned into neglect of Mateo. Mm-hmm. And so over time, he actually accidentally ingested a large amount of an illegal substance, so much so that he had a near fatal episode.
This is really scary and unfortunately a trend that we're seeing too.
Right. It is so scary. And, luckily Mateo has fully recovered from this incident and is completely healthy today. Yeah. But in the aftermath of that incident, his parents faced criminal charges and honestly a long road to recovery. Sure. So in the meantime, Mateo had another family member step up to care for him. And that family member, who we refer to as a kinship caregiver, was really intent on addressing the disruption in Mateo's life in a healthy way, which we were so thankful for. Yeah. This caregiver sought out advice and encouragement from Mateo's CASA advocate on how to care for him, while also continuing to nurture, his attachment to his biological parents who were temporarily not with him.
Yeah, I love everything that this caregiver is doing because he's understanding the importance of attachment in child development.
Right.
And I really love that Mateo has two caring adults in his life while he can't be with his parents. Mm-hmm. And that is his kinship caregiver, but it also sounds like his CASA advocate.
Right. And we'll see how these two adults in his life will benefit Mateo when we circle back around to the case at the end of the episode.
Good.
But in the meantime, let's say again that when we use the word attachment, we're talking about the emotional bond, right, that forms between a child and their primary caregiver. Mm-hmm. And this bond is important because it provides the child with a sense of security and trust, and then that influences how they interact with others and how they, handle relationships throughout life, honestly.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to remember or just think about that attachment doesn't just happen overnight.
Right.
It develops over time and then in stages of child development as well.
Yeah. And really, attachment is in the really early stages of child development.
Like many things, that is most important.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're talking, the birth to infant to toddler ages.
Yeah.
So very, very important early stages. And there are actually 4 specific stages of attachment that researchers have identified. And so I was thinking, Kristin, that maybe we can just go through them one by one.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I like a good breakdown, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive right in.
Okay.
So the first stage is called the pre-attachment stage.
Okay.
And this occurs from birth to about 6 weeks.
Yeah, 6 weeks. So again, listener, we're talking about early development here.
Very early. And at this point, infants don't show a preference for a specific caregiver. They're just responding to their needs being met. So anyone who is meeting needs like feeding and comfort, right, is good. But they're also already making associations, hopefully positive, related to having their needs met.
Right. If I cry, I'm fed.
Very simple.
Like simple.
But exactly. And then from there, we move into what's called attachment in the making stage.
Okay.
And this lasts from about 6 weeks to 6 or 7 months. And this is when infants really start to recognize their primary caregivers.
Yeah, and maybe even to a certain extent show a preference for caregivers, right? They might smile, like if they recognize you. They might be more easily soothed maybe by someone.
Yeah, they're starting to build that trust. And, I think we've all probably heard people say things like, oh, my baby actually knows me now,
Right, it's a little heartwarming.
Yeah. So they start to become more purposefully responsive.
Yes.
And so then the third stage is called just the clear-cut attachment stage.
Okay.
And this happens between around 7 months and 2 years. So we start to widen that gap of development here.
Sure.
And this is when babies form a strong attachment to their primary caregiver.
Yeah.
And they might even show some of that separation anxiety when the caregiver leaves, but then also might be visibly excited when they return.
Right. It's like that good and bad of separation anxiety, right? It means an attachment has formed, which is clearly good. Yeah. But it makes leaving so hard, right? The baby or toddler may now cry when a caregiver leaves the room. It's tough on the heart, but it's totally normal.
Totally normal. And yeah, it can be difficult, but it's normal, and it's actually a good sign of a healthy attachment and part of normal development. Then we really turn to this fourth and final stage, which is the formation of reciprocal relationships.
Right.
And this begins around age 2 and continues through childhood.
Okay.
This is when toddlers and young children start to understand that their caregivers will come back. They learn to cope with brief separations better.
Sure.
And they also begin forming more of what we would call a give and take relationship.
Yeah. And I feel like what we see is that's in terms of relationships with their caregiver, right? Yeah. But as they continue to develop, they're now forming the ability to create relationships with others too, like peers or other adults.
That's right. And, that's why healthy early attachment is so important, because it's actually the foundation for all other future relationships.
Yeah, it really is.
And so these stages define the natural development of attachment in what we would say would be the most ideal type of situation, what we want.
Right. But unfortunately, that's not always possible or the case.
Right.
And there are factors that can hinder how strong or how secure attachment is. And, we see this a lot in the children we serve at CASA, because they have had disruptions or big life changes happen that affect this kind of progression.
Yes, exactly. And one of the big factors is a caregiver's responsiveness.
Yes,
right?
it's
key. Neglect comes in. So when caregivers can consistently meet a child's needs with reliability, with warmth, we get that secure attachment.
Yes.
It's a good thing. But if that caregiver is inconsistent or neglectful, then the attachment may be what we call insecure.
Right.
Not sure.
It's a little rocky, maybe. Right. Yeah. And, so thinking about our experience at CASA, some of the kind of scenarios that I'm picturing are maybe a caregiver who's working multiple jobs and not home a lot, right? So they're not there to form that attachment and respond to needs. Right. Maybe a caregiver who's dealing with depression and just not actively or proactively engaging with the child. Maybe a caregiver who's consumed with substance abuse or substance use and not responding immediately to a baby's cries.
Right. Those are all really good examples of situations where caregivers might be struggling with other barriers or issues and concerns, but then that's resulting in their inability to be responding immediately and or consistently to that child's needs.
Exactly. And there's so many other factors we see that can also influence healthy attachment. A parent or caregiver who's absent is something that we commonly see. teen parents who don't know how to respond to the baby's needs, right? So they're not consistently meeting that need because they just don't even understand what the needs are.
Right.
And then we see a lot of parental mental health challenges that prevent that healthy attachment.
Right. And even cultural practices.
Yeah.
Right. So some cultures emphasize independence early, while others focus more on close physical proximity.
Yeah.
There's certainly no single right way, and cultures are wonderful, but we do have to create a secure emotional connection in a way that works for the family.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And so, like always, we want to focus on the positive, right? Like, what can we do to help children's attachment?
Right.
And what do we do, especially when that attachment hasn't maybe formed naturally and positively during those early years of child development?
Right. And listener, all hope isn't lost.
Which is always
yes, that's always our message, we hope. Yeah.
And so when Kristin and I were planning this, we thought, well, maybe we could provide a few tips that we could pass along as ways that can help foster stronger attachment with a child.
Yes. Okay. So our first tip is really simple. Be available.
Love that. That is the consistency piece.
Right. And it's like anything, easier said than done.
Sure.
But, give your child attention on a regular basis. That might mean putting away our phones or devices for an amount of time each day. Maybe it looks like initiating a conversation with a child, making space for, daily play and interaction. It could be, making an effort to respond right away when they're trying to flag you down and ask you a question.
Right. And while the idea of being available is basic, come on, we all know it can be a challenge, right? Because there are so many people and things, whether it's family or work,
Yeah, it could be good things.
It could be great things, but they're still all vying for attention.
Right.
And so then we have to guard our time to a certain extent and make sure, though, that we're sharing important quality time with our children.
Correct. And that's so true. And that's why I love what our CASA advocates do, because they're showing up each week to spend time, directly with a child. Okay, so listener, our second tip is to delight in children, which again sounds so simple, right? But so many of our interactions with kids are about meeting needs or things that are necessary, like guiding them and instructing them, directing them, disciplining them, right? It's a long list. Yes.
Yes, but that can't be all of the interactions, right? So we do need interactions in warm and inviting ways, the hugs and smiles, eye contact, praise, playing with them. Right?
Yeah. And I love that you say praise. And that reminds me that we don't want to only praise behaviors. We want to praise who they are, right? Just kind of delight in them, their little personalities, make an effort to enjoy, who they are in this world.
That's great, because they're all individuals.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And then the third and final tip I'll pass along is to really try to be purposeful and get involved with what interests the child.
Oh my gosh, that's exactly why I originally got into fantasy football. I was trying to have a connection with my son.
Well, that's great. And now you're hooked, though. That's how it goes.
Yep.
Of course, you want to win. I know.
Maybe I have a trophy at my house.
Right.
I don't know.
But I hear you and I get that. And so really it is going beyond maybe our own natural interests to really ask your child and learn what things they're interested in.
Right, because being interested in the things they like is really showing an interest in them, right? That's how it's interpreted.
Yeah.
And it's just an entryway to building stronger attachment.
Exactly. So while we've been chatting about this, I'm still thinking about Mateo.
I know, sweet Mateo.
Yeah. So when his natural progression of attachment was disrupted, how did it affect him?
Yeah, so glad you asked, right? So Mateo obviously had a change in caregivers at an early age, which did disrupt his attachment. But like we started to talk about, luckily his kinship caregiver was very intentional about nurturing Mateo, and that helped Mateo attach to this kind of temporary caregiver, which was healthy.
And you may have said this, but I don't remember. Was the long-term goal to stay with this caregiver, or was it to try to return him to his parents?
Great question, because this was a a really frightening incident, right?
Yeah.
And it turned out to be the incident that the parents needed to realize that their number one priority was Mateo.
Well, that's great.
They love him. They truly want to raise him. And they were both willing to step up and put in the work, individually. Yeah, it's hard work, but they were doing that individually. They were doing that together because they wanted to address their substance use. They wanted to make positive changes to prevent future relapses and problems. And they wanted to learn how to raise Mateo in a healthy way. And they had both their CASA advocate and a parent coach kind of helping them throughout this process. Because everyone, the CASA advocate, the parent coach, this kinship caregiver that was there on a temporary basis, they all agreed that it was in Mateo's best long-term interest to be with his parents if it was safe to do so.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? Is that if it is safe to do so, that's what we want. And we want children to be reunited with what we call their family of origin if it is safe.
Exactly. And so Mateo is participating in more and more visits with his parents. They're being consistent in their affection and interaction with him, but they're also giving him a little time and space to get comfortable, right? Because they haven't been present for a while. No one wants to rush this process, but they're on the right track and they're implementing advice from this parent coach and they're moving through the phases of attachment with Mateo. And I have no doubt that this little guy has a really bright future, with the care and support of his parents and this kinship caregiver who will continue to be a source of encouragement.
I think it's a great story and, a really nice explanation of attachment and how it could be disrupted but then rebuilt. And I'm very excited to see what the future will hold for him.
Me too. So listener, clearly we want to raise secure kids, right? Because having those roots is the predecessor to them growing wings. And that's what we want, right? For them to just be out in the world living up to their full potential. So their emotional attachment now will affect their future well-being and quality of life, right?
And research shows us that securely attached children, right? So it's a secure, healthy attachment, grow into adults who are then better able to form their own healthy relationships and then to have high self-esteem and then to demonstrate better emotional regulation overall.
Yeah, so I feel like the message is don't wait, right? Like focus on building attachment now.
I think that is great. And so your call to action for the week, listeners, is to set aside your device for at least an hour.
I think we can do it.
Let's try. But, delight in any children that are in your life, play a game, take a walk with them, have direct and purposeful face-to-face interactions. But these can all be baby steps toward building stronger attachments.
Love it. Thank you for listening to Vigilant Voices, Henrico Casa's podcast. We have a vision for all children to live in safe, healthy homes. You can help us make that happen. Tell a friend about our podcast and find us on social media.
I believe in the better days.